This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College, and this week I'll be continuing talking about the Romans. Right now I'm kind of getting into the rise of the Roman Empire, which really begins under Emperor Augustus, who of course was originally called Octavian, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. So I'll talk about how Augustus kind of is the one that's the father of the Roman Empire that really begins everything by the first century. We of course have the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty that he helps to begin. We'll talk about the rise of those early emperors that they have. Then I'll get into also in the first century how Christianity began in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where modern Israel is today. So I'll kind of talk about who Jesus was and how Christianity started to really come to fruition in that first century. So we'll get into that. I'll also get into as well talking about some other dynasties that the early Roman Empire had. You had what they call the Flavian dynasty, which that particular dynasty was known for emperors like Emperor Vespasian, who built the well-known Roman Colosseum. We'll kind of get to that later, how that comes to fruition. Then I'll talk about some of the later emperors, like his two sons he has, Titus and Domitian. Then I'll get into talking about how the Roman Empire peaks in the Pax Romana with the so-called period of the five good emperors. So I'll kind of mention some emperors like you may have heard of, such as Emperor Trajan, Hadrian, and of course the more well-known today probably, which is Marcus Aurelius. So again, that particular emperors. Then I'll talk about how the Roman Empire begins to decline. You got this emperor named Commodus that comes in, the son of Marcus Aurelius. I think the Pax Romana ends about that time. And then I'll get into and talk about how the Severan dynasty, that dynasty founded by Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, is one of the last major empires, dynasties that really um, peaks before we have uh, kind of a decline in the Roman Empire. So I'll talk about how Rome kind of goes to this period called the crisis period. The crisis period of 3rd century, where the Roman Empire almost breaks up. So I'll kind of get to that later, because that's going to lead into the Roman Empire declining between the 3rd and the 5th centuries AD. So that's going to be kind of a later lecture I'll have. But this kind of preview I've got for this week is going to be really for parts 1 and 2, discussing how the Roman Empire goes up from Emperor Augustus to about the Severan dynasty. So later in the semester, I'll probably have like an assessment on the Roman Empire lectures. This will probably be a main major assessment, which will be on y'all's final exam. So it's kind of going into the background of that. But next week I'll wrap up the Roman Empire, and I'll have also a review as well.
So anyway, like I said, today I'm going to move on to talk about the Roman Empire. I'm going to get into the background of how the empire begins with Octavian, who becomes known as Emperor Augustus. So he's one that starts the Roman Empire. I'll talk a little bit about the early emperors. You do have the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty. That's really your first, dynasty of emperors that come in. And I should have time to maybe talk a little bit about the rise of Christianity, which kind of begins also about the same time. So anyway, like I said, last time I had talked about Julius Caesar, how he had been murdered, with the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. So I'm going to kind of be getting into like talking about how the Roman Empire rises after that period because of what happens with Octavian. So we'll talk about that and kind of explain who Octavian is. Really done that much about that yet at this point. Now get into like the other later period of the Roman Empire, Roman state that kind of forms after that. But yeah, a little bit of Octavian there. You can see an image of him. He's got different names that he goes by. I think Octavius is another name you'll sometimes see as well. He's actually a grandnephew of Julius Caesar, who was only like 19 when uh, actually Julius Caesar was killed in 44 BC. So basically, he's going to come in. He's actually adopted by Julius Caesar. I guess in his will, he claims his name as well. I think his full name is Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian, I think, or Octavianus, I think is the name he kind of goes by later. And what happens is he forms this alliance with these other men you see here, Marcus Lepidus and Mark Antony, also known as Marcus Antonius. Both those were generals of basically Julius Caesar, and they formed this alliance predominantly to go after the liberators, the ones that had, killed Julius Caesar in 44. So yeah, it actually precipitated a civil war. They had the Civil War break out right afterwards in 44, 43 BC, I guess is how long it lasts, down to about 42 BC. And it was called the Liberators' Civil War. And I think I've got images showing that right here. But basically, you had two sides that pitted against each other. You had Mark Antony and Octavian mostly against Brutus and Cassius. Those are the two that, remember, had been the main conspirators that had killed Julius Caesar. Yeah, peak of the war, like really 43 to 42 BC, you can see. And most of the fighting was done in the east, like in Greece. And I think the pivotal battle they talk about is the Battle of Philippi, which was actually two battles. I think that took place in October. Usually October 3rd or in October 23rd, I think was the two main dates when they fought basically against Cassius and Brutus. And both of them were defeated. And I think if you know about Brutus and Cassius, they actually committed suicide is what happened. So that's basically what happened with that. But going back to that triumvirate I was just talking about a second ago, it actually had an official name that they called it. It was usually dubbed, I think I've got the name right here. It was called the Triumvirate for Organizing the Republic. That's what it was called. They divided it up into different provinces. And so each one of those rulers kind of reigned over a part of the actual republic. But over time, what happened was Marcus Lepidus became less powerful. And by 36 BC, he was pushed out. You only had two left afterwards, which is Octavian and Mark Antony. So I think that second triumvirate, that alliance between those three men, lasted about 7 years, just like the first one did. I think the other one lasted about 7 years too, as well. I think I've got some other issues, I think some other signs right here. Now, of course, the other thing that happened, Antony ended up getting like the eastern part of the republic, and I think Octavian got the western half. And what happened was Antony ended up in this relationship with Cleopatra, we've talked about before, and kind of show you kind of an image right here. But that's kind of how they divided up the whole republic between the two. So that like, part of Spain, Gaul, Italy, and part of North Africa, all that went to Octavian. So he kind of controlled that area. And then Mark Antony got kind of control of the east, which you see there, Greece, Turkey, Syria, I think mostly. And then, of course, as you know, he had this relationship that he started with basically with Cleopatra. And I kind of show it right here. So Octavian controlled the western part, Antony controlled the eastern part. And they had this mutual alliance, by the way. Part of what cemented it, by the way, was the fact that Mark Antony married Octavian's sister, whose name was Octavia. And so that's kind of what, I guess, kept the glue together between the two triumvirs, those two men, Octavian and Antony. But what happened was when he went to the east, he started this relationship with Cleopatra, if you know about this. And I think that's part of what led to why, the Republic broke up. because it led to a civil war, like a final civil war that'll break out later between the two. And Cleopatra was, still the ruler of the Ptolemaic Egypt, and Antony and her had a bunch of children together. Actually, had 3 children at one point together. I think it kind of shows you most of the children in that image. Cleopatra Selene, Ptolemy Philadelphos, and Alexander Helios. Those were actually the 3 children between Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And then Cleopatra also had Ptolemy the 15th, who was actually the son of Julius Caesar as well. I think he called him Caesarion, actually. And so I think he co-ruled with his mom, but Cleopatra was really the one controlling the power in Egypt at that point. So they think that's what eventually caused pretty much the split between Octavian and Antony is, of course, because of the influence of Cleopatra. And that is considered, by the way, to be one of the most famous, love affairs in ancient times. Antony and Cleopatra. He actually divorced his wife Octavia to marry her in the year 32 BC. So that's kind of part of what caused the rift, afterwards. So that led to what they call the War of Actium that happened between 32 and 30 BC. And so what occurred, because of the fact that, it looks like Antony and Cleopatra are trying to control the east from Egypt, it ends up causing this, war between both sides. And it was called the War of Actium because of a famous naval battle associated with that conflict, which was called the Battle of Actium, which was fought off the coast of Greece in September of 31 BC. And so you had a deal where Octavian and the Roman Senate declared war on Antony and Cleopatra. And so basically Antony's forces invaded into the eastern part. And that led to the fall of Ptolemaic Egypt, because after their naval forces were wiped out, Octavian was able then to occupy, of course, Egypt afterwards. I'll get to it later, but they do have this general that's under Octavian that's kind of important. His name was Marcus Agrippa, who was actually a very close friend of Octavian. He had a lot to do with why Octavian's forces were so superior at that point. He later married Octavian's only daughter, which I think her name was Julia, I think also as well. And I think she also ended later up marrying Tiberius too, who was later the second Roman emperor after Augustus died. But of course, what ends up happening, if you know about it, you get the death of Cleopatra, also the death of Mark Antony too occurs with that. Mark Antony committed suicide, and they think after Octavian took Alexandria in 31 BC, that Cleopatra, they think, eventually committed suicide too in 30 BC. It's been debated about that, about what happened with Cleopatra. Some claim that Octavian may have had her killed instead, because they're not sure. They haven't really been able to find her tomb. The tomb of Queen Cleopatra, that's kind of missing. So I guess if they ever figured that out, they could find out how she killed herself, or if she was killed or not. Of course, the claim from ancient times, I think from Plutarch, is that she used a poisonous snake to kill herself. So from there, with Octavian taking Egypt and Mark Antony and Cleopatra pretty much out the way, from there, what ends up occurring is that then you get this deal where Octavian comes in and he becomes, the first Roman emperor, which eventually, I guess the dates, will be the official dates of when he becomes emperor is 27 BC to about 14 CE is the dates of it. And basically, with Cleopatra gone, Mark Antony gone, he's able to solidify his control of the whole republic. And so from there, they think that that's the beginnings of the Roman Empire. And so Actually, the Romans are going to call him Caesar Augustus, if you know about this from his actual name, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And he'll get the title Augustus, which will be a title that's given to him by the Roman Senate, they think in the year 27 BC, but actually really reigns from, I guess, 30 BC. So he reigned about 44, 45 years. He was in power as actual the ruler. So he is one of the longest reigning rulers in Roman history as well. And a lot of people think that Octavian or Augustus is considered one of the greatest rulers in history as well. So yeah, we're going to get to it next. I'm going to, of course, talk about the beginnings of the Roman Empire. So you see this map here. You can see that's the extent, like we said, of the Roman Empire, which the dates for the Roman Empire, they usually go from traditionally 27 BC to 476 CE. So you've got the age of Augustus, which is the beginning period of it. And then it goes up to the fall of the West, when the Western Empire collapses, conquered by various barbarians in that year. So you can see that the Roman Empire lasts, at least the main part of it lasts about 500 years. You do have the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire that continues in the East later, but it shrinks over time during the Middle Ages. But remnants of the Roman Empire actually last till 1453 CE. It's pretty amazing about that. But yeah, let me get to Augustus. So I said, Augustus is the first Roman emperor. Of course, I guess officially they usually put the dates of his reign from 27 BC to 14 CE. But like I said, they think he starts really ruling over the whole thing around 30 BC. So 44, 45 years is how long he was in power. They do kind of see Augustus as being the founding father of the Roman Empire. So he's kind of like George Washington to like the United States would be in comparison to that. They usually put that date I was talking about, Augustus, because I told you that was a title that the Roman Senate gave him in the year 27 BC. So hence, that's usually the date that they start the Roman Empire from. And there's different translations of what Augustus means. I think in that little video, they said it meant exalted one. Also, I think other translations would be like he's a great person, like a great one, I think is another one, or the venerable, I think is another translation. Basically saying that he's just this great ruler that's been, elevated to almost like godlike status. And yeah, he was. Like after he died, he was actually deified as an actual god to the Romans. He didn't like the title Augustus. He preferred another title, of course, that is more well known, which is actually the full title is Princeps Civitas, which you see there, which they shorten it later to Princeps. That's usually how they say it. Some say Princeps. It's kind of where the word prince or princess comes from originally. And it's a title meaning first citizen, because he was trying to say that he was this head of the Roman Republic. And so traditionally it was this idea to restore the Roman Republic, but they think it was really like a monarchical regime. The emperor really becomes like a monarch over time. And that's something that the later rulers kind of see themselves as for sure, which are the so-called Caesars, which is the term they use for a lot of the Roman emperors. The word emperor is more from the word imperator, you may have heard of, which is a title that they would give to victorious Roman generals when they would give them a triumph, through the city of Rome. So that's the other name they sometimes called them later in modern times. Because of the title Princeps, they do kind of talk about the early Roman Empire being called the Principate period of the Roman Empire. So 27 BC to 284 CE or AD, all the emperors go by that title Princeps. And then I'll get to Emperor Diocletian later adopts the title Dominus. And so you have another period later called the Dominate period, usually 284 to 476, when all the emperors use that title instead of Princeps. So yeah, like I said, he's the founder of the Roman Empire. And one thing about him, he does start this golden age they always talk about, and they were discussing it in the video, which is the age of Augustus. And it's considered like I said, a golden age, not just of like, when the empire peaked, but it's a golden age of like literature, art, and culture. Like they talked about the Aeneid being written by Virgil, a lot of different works like the histories of, I think they were talking about Livy's History of Rome was written during that time. Also, Tacitus wrote some of his work around that same time, also as well. So you get these different writers that are kind of writing about that same time period. Other things he did to Augustus, he reformed the tax system, actually standardized their coinage system is something they start to see afterwards. And you get the emperors being put on the coins and things like that. He created civil services, and you can see, developed a network of roads throughout the whole empire, built aqueducts. I think he doubled the size of the Roman Empire or something like that also during his reign as well. So he's known for a lot of expansion projects and rebuilding Rome and making it like marble, like they were saying. So yeah, there's images right there showing, of course, him, of course, Octavian, or of course, known as Augustus. I did begin, of course, the famous, you may have heard of the Pax Romana. It's something he's kind of well known. Here's, by the way, a map showing you the size of the Roman Empire that's eventually going to expand over time. So that's the peak period of what we call the so-called Pax Romana, which peaks from about 27 BC to about 180 CE. And the Pax Romana is really the peak of Roman prosperity, when it was really the greatest in size, which I think was something like maybe a little over 2 million square miles at one point. It was also the most peaceful in history as well. There were very few wars that were actually fought within that 200-year period. I think they might have one, I think, in the year of the four emperors in 69 CE, when they have like a civil war break out. But other than that, most of that time period was very peaceful. I think after that, there's never been a period in history where it was that peaceful. I think the only thing they maybe compare it to was like maybe Pax Britannica, I think, when the British Empire controlled the world between the 19th and 20th centuries, where it was almost like somewhat peaceful as well. But you don't see anything like that afterwards. Like pretty much from after that period, it's nothing but wars up to modern times. Oh, one more thing too about I'll kind of mention about. I'll kind of go back to that slide right there, which is right. He did create this thing called the Praetorian Guard. You may have heard about. The Praetorian Guard was this imperial bodyguard of the Roman emperors. He founded that, they think, right after Julius Caesar was assassinated, and it became this specialized imperial guard unit that protected the emperor and his family. It's about the size of a Roman legion, and it's kind of important later. The Praetorian Guard, is vital in really controlling a lot of the interests of the emperor, but also deciding sometimes who might be the next emperor or successor that comes in. I think there's even a case where the Praetorian Guards would sometimes kill off the emperor if they didn't like him for some reason or didn't pay him enough. So that sometimes happened as well. I'll get to it later, but Octavian or Augustus is also known for creating the first imperial dynasty of the Roman Empire, which is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Let me also mention, too, about some of the different writers that write about that period. Kind of show this list right here, but those are some examples of some of the different Roman historians that kind of write around this time. So you got, Tacitus, is one of them, Suetonius, Dio Cassius. I think those are kind of considered some of the most famous ones that are kind of well known in Roman history. I think I've got better images of them right here. So we got Tacitus on the left, Suetonius in the middle, and then Dio Cassius. The one on the left, Tacitus, is really considered to be one of the greatest of the Roman historians. Annals of Rome, histories of Rome are kind of written around that time. Both those books kind of gives a lot of historical work on like the biographical background of a lot of the emperors in the first century, especially the Julio-Claudian dynasty, etc. I think Tacitus even writes up to the time of the Flavian dynasty as well. And then also the Life of Agricola was another work that Tacitus also wrote, which is about his father-in-law, who was a Roman general that conquered part of Britain. Was actually a governor of Britain at one point. So he gives kind of some history of like the conquest of Britain. Then Germania was another work that Tacitus wrote, which is one of the first historical works written on ancient Germany at the time, which the Romans called it Germania. Then the historian in the middle is Suetonius. Suetonius wrote a series of biographies that were called the 12 Caesars. And they cover from like the life of Julius Caesar, who was not really considered an emperor, by the way, but a dictator of Rome. And he does cover the first 11 emperors. He goes through like the Julio-Claudian dynasty up through the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, 69 CE. And then he covers up through the Flavian dynasty, which collapsed in 96 CE. So he kind of covers a lot of the first century. And then also Dio Cassius, who was sometimes called Cassius Dio, it's usually written either way. He's got an extensive work that's called The History of Rome. It's like an 80-volume work that was, I think, written a little later, but I think written around the 3rd century CE. But he has a history that covers like from the founding of Rome in the 8th century up to the Severan dynasty, 3rd century CE. It's like almost like 1,000 years. And I think most of it's still in extent today if you read about Dio Cassius. So all three of those are kind of important historians that give us a lot of history about the Roman emperors, especially in the 1st century, which we're talking a little about today. Let me get into and talk about for a few minutes some of the famous emperors that came after Augustus died. So you got this series of emperors that are founded by Augustus, this dynasty called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It's called that because it's actually two families that intermarried. You have the Julian family related back to Julius Caesar and Octavian. They do have another family called the Claudian family that intermarries into the Julian family. And this dynasty lasts almost 100 years. It's around from 27 BC to 68 CE. So it's the first imperial dynasty of the Roman Empire. It's the only one that's actually related back to Julius Caesar and Octavian. So all the emperors that come later are not related back to the original founders of the empire. So you can see the list of them right here. So besides Augustus, you see on the left, you've got Tiberius, you've got Caligula, you've got Claudius, and then you've got Nero. So we'll talk about all four of those that come after Augustus died. They think Augustus died of natural causes, as far as they know, after he reigned like 44 or 45 years in power. So there they are right there again. So Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula. Claudius is sometimes called Claudius the First because there's two emperors named Claudius. Then Nero, of course, also on the far right as well. So there you got Tiberius. So Tiberius, like I said, is the second Roman emperor. He is actually considered to be the second longest reigning emperor, at least up to the 5th century. Reigned from 14 to 37 CE, like 23 years or so that he was in power. And Tiberius was this former Roman general that was basically adopted and became the successor to Augustus. And he later actually would go on to marry Augustus' daughter. I think her name was Julia the Elder, they called her. So he kind of married into the Augustus family. I think that's where the Claudian kind of line kind of comes in at that point. And he was not very popular. That's one thing about Tiberius. He actually was kind of tyrannical as a ruler. And there was a deal where he started reigning from like afar, like from outside Rome, from like an island off the coast of Italy called the Isle of Capri, or Island of Capri, it's called. And he actually used the Praetorian Guard and maybe the Roman Senate to kind of run the state, basically. So a lot of the Romans didn't like him at all. In fact, when he died, they were yelling something like "Tiberius to the Tiber," like throw him in the Tiber, something like that. And it was a case where they had all these treason trials that took place throughout the empire because Tiberius was suspicious of people conspiring to assassinate him and kill him off. I guess what happened with maybe Julius Caesar or something like that. And so he had put people on trial. People were in prison. I think it was a case where some people were even put to death under him as well. They think that may have been somehow connected to, they're not sure that's connected to Jesus Christ or not, Jesus of Nazareth, but they do think that Jesus was put on trial during that same time period that Tiberius was in power because he was crucified at the end of his reign and all that. So they think the beginning of early Christianity kind of starts about that time period when Tiberius is in power. But he's not very popular. Tiberius was hated by the people and all that. And I guess it was hard trying to come in after Augustus had reigned. He was like real popular and all that. Then, of course, they had his nephew that came in, which is Caligula. Caligula was the third Roman emperor, of course, that would take power, not in power long. 4 years he was in power. And it's kind of a story about this, but they think Tiberius was like 77 when he died. He was like pretty much really old and dying at that point. And apparently he had died, or they thought he had died. And apparently he got revived or something like that. And so they think there's a story that Caligula's nephew sent some people and have Tiberius smothered to death so he could take over afterwards. And so Caligula comes in, and if you know about Caligula, he's this unstable ruler that some people claim may have been crazy or insane, they believe. And kind of about him, it's got some information about him right there. So nephew of Emperor Tiberius. He was actually the son of this Roman general that was real popular named Germanicus, who had fought like in Germany and other places, I think in Britain as well. He was also a brother of Tiberius. I think both came from the Claudian family and all that. And apparently his mother used to dress him up as a little soldier, like a legionnaire. And so Caligula got this nickname. He was called Little Boot or Little Boots. So that's actually one of the nicknames that he was called, Little Boot or Little Boots. But his real name was actually, I kind of show it right here. His real name was Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But he went by the name Gaius, but a lot of people called him Little Boot or Little Boots, which I don't think you could, tell that to his face, that kind of thing. But they do think he was actually considered related back to Augustus. I think he called him the great grandson of Augustus or something like that. It's kind of like his lineage, they believe. Like I said, he was unstable. He killed a lot of his relatives. Like a lot of his relatives were either exiled or killed under his reign. I think he killed a bunch of people he thought that might be a threat to his throne. There's stories where he had affairs with his sister or sisters. There's one story, I think it's Suetonius, that mentions that he might have had an affair with his sister Drusilla, but they're not sure if that's true or not. Might be exaggerated. He did have this racehorse that he had that was famous, named Incitatus, well known. I think this story that may have been true about this. And there was a deal where he threatened to make his racehorse Roman consul because nobody else he thought was any good to do it. So he was going to make his horse Roman consul. And I think he would give lavish balls for it, like parties for his horse. I think it was used for like chariot racing and things like that. There's a story where he drained all the actual bank accounts of Rome. I think when Caligula came in, they had a surplus of money. And after his reign, they had nothing left. He spent all the money lavishly. He actually instigated the invasion of Britain, but they never really went through with it. They do think he kind of leads to eventually the Romans going into Britain later. But Caligula was unstable. There's been debates about what may have drove him that way. I think there's a theory that it may have been caused by actual, like an illness that actually struck him. But he was murdered. One thing about him, he's actually assassinated on the date of June 24th, 41 CE. Praetorian Guard killed him in a conspiracy, actually killed him and his whole family, like wiped him out. And from there, they put his uncle on the throne afterwards, of course, which will be actually, sorry about that, Little Boots, as they call him right there, will be replaced by his uncle Claudius. Claudius comes in, and I think the reason why he didn't kill Claudius off was because of the fact that I think they thought he was an idiot or something like that. But Claudius would end up being a pretty good emperor compared to probably Caligula or maybe later Nero as well. So that's who I want to talk about a little bit. By the way, Caligula, if you know about it, kind of a controversy today. Of course, there's kind of debate about how crazy he really was. But I do know at modern times, they've made movies about Caligula. You've heard of the 1979 movie called Caligula, which was directed by Tinto Brass, starring Malcolm McDowell. It's like almost like a soft porn movie or something like that. So they basically have made movies like that before. And I guess that's kind of helped to kind of maybe people see maybe why he may have been crazy more in modern times, but it may have been exaggerated, how unstable he really was. Well, let's get back to Claudius. Now, Claudius, like I said, comes in as emperor in the year 41. There he is right there, Claudius, a fourth Roman emperor, the uncle of Caligula. He, of course, comes in and restores the actual order of the Roman Empire. You can see reign about 13 years, 41 to 54 CE. They do think he may have been the second best ruler of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, of those emperors that are here. Because, Tiberius, tyrannical, Caligula, maybe unstable, possibly crazy, insane, they're not sure. And then maybe, of course, Nero, they think tyrannical as well. One thing about him, it says he's the first Roman emperor born outside of Italy. That's really true about that. In fact, it was, I think, the Praetorian Guard that was from Gaul, they're Gaelic, I think. You say about this. They actually were the ones that were kind of loyal to Claudius. They helped him get in power, they think, afterwards. So because of that, he allowed all the free people outside of Italy to start getting Roman citizenship, because that's something you start seeing actually happening throughout the Roman Empire. So that is something he's kind of known for. Probably, though, the most famous thing he started really was the conquest of Rome and Britain. That was started, they think, in the year 43 CE. Although I told you that Caligula, they think, was starting to, prepare to, possibly invade. I think it was even a deal where they crossed the English Channel, and the only thing they did was they collected seashells or something like that, and they crossed back over. It was kind of comical about that. But under his reign, they actually start trying to conquer it and expand into Rome and Britain. And the Romans will later conquer most of England up to where, like, the southern part of Scotland is today. That'll take a while, but I think it takes them something like 40-something years to actually conquer that part of that region you're looking at in that map. So the one on the right kind of shows you kind of the areas that they'll conquer, mostly the northern, middle part and southern part of England. That'll all be conquered pretty much by the Romans. And I think at one point they do conquer maybe up to southern Scotland, but they kind of back down from there, though. Now, I'll kind of talk about Nero next, how he gets into power. Well, there's this deal where supposedly Claudius had 4 wives at one point that he married. And he had this 4th wife, which was Agrippina the Younger, who, by the way, happened to be the sister of Caligula, that he basically marries, also called Agrippina Minor as well. And they think she may have conspired to kill Claudius, like maybe poisoning him, to put her own son on the throne, which is Nero. So basically, Nero ends up getting on the throne because of that. Also, Agrippina was also the daughter of Roman General Germanicus, as well. So it's kind of a lineage of that in the Claudian family, et cetera, I was talking about before. And so that's how Nero actually ends up being the ruler. He's like real young when he comes in. I think he's only like, I want to say he was 16 when he became emperor at that point. So you can see fifth Roman emperor, last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, reigns from 54 to 68 CE, so about 14 years that he's in power. Yeah, he's actually this ruler that was at first popular when he came in, but he was known for being tyrannical. I'll kind of show a few things about him in there. So yeah, adopted son of Claudius, which he was. And then what happened was his mother, Agrippina the Younger, which is the sister of Caligula, conspired, they think, to kill Claudius off to get him on the throne. And then if you know what happened a few years after, like I want to say 4 or 5 years after he took power, he killed his mother off. I guess she was too powerful. They say that Agrippina the Younger was the power behind his throne early on. There were even stories that circulated that they had an affair, like he had an affair with his mother. Which I don't think it's true about that. He also killed 2 of his wives. He had 3 wives at one point that Nero married. He killed his first 2 wives, and then there's a story where he married 2 men, which is kind of bizarre about this. But he had 2 men castrated at one point and married them both. So it's kind of a bizarre story about Nero. Nero was also known for being an actor, musician. He participated in the Olympics in Greece. And so I think he would force people to actually watch him, like put on plays or recite poetry and things like that. But he thought he was this great artist, that the world needed in general. I'll kind of talk about some major events that happened under his reign. Now, there's this event that happened, they think around 60 CE, which was the Boeotian Revolt. You may have heard about. And apparently there was this deal where Nero's armies had to put down this rebellion by some of the Briton tribes that were there, like, I guess, really back to the Celts and all that. And they had this tribe that was called the Iceni, that was like in the eastern part of England. And they revolted against Nero's occupation of Britain, which they were starting to take over at this point. It was a very bloody affair. I think they say something like 70 to 80,000 people were killed by Boudicca's forces as they rampaged across what we now call England today. And actually, the actual ancient Roman town of London, which was called Londinium, was actually burned down by them. So it led to a lot of people being killed. But eventually, they captured Boudicca and they had her executed. Of course, is what happened to her later. But it's something today that the British still kind of see her as this like national heroine, that kind of tried to struggle against oppression, Roman oppression, I guess, at that point, as the, British tried to occupy and control that part of, Britain back then, which they will up to like the 4th, 5th century. The Romans will be there for, several centuries in control of it. So that's something kind of famous that happened kind of under her reign. His reign, of course. Now, they have the other thing that's really more famous that happened under, of course, Nero, which is the Great Fire of Rome, which happened in the year 64 CE. They think Nero was still popular up to that point, and then this fire broke out, and he was blamed for it, especially by a lot of the people later in Rome. And the fire lasted almost a week, like 6 to 7 days, that actually burned down a good part of Rome. Here's kind of images showing you like the map of the actual fire, the extent of the fire itself right there on the right. They think that the fire started on July the 18th, 64 CE. It lasted almost a week, like maybe 6 days I think there's a theory that it maybe lasted a few more days after that. There's a theory that the fire broke out in the Circus Maximus, where they have the racetrack, where they have like chariot racing in Rome. And you see it ended up burning down. Something like 60,000 buildings or more were burned. And they think something like 10 out of there's like 14 districts in Rome. 10 out of the 14 districts in Rome actually burned, which is like, I want to say three-fourths of the city burned. But they're not sure the death toll. That's the only thing about it. There's kind of a mystery about how many people died, but it did create a lot of refugees, of course, from the actual fire that broke out. Here's, of course, some of the ruins of Emperor Nero's palace. He's going to build a palace afterwards, and this is what really started the controversy. It's called the Golden House. And so some people started to think that maybe he burned out certain sections of the city so he could build this lavish palace at that point, which some even Roman historians kind of accuse him of. And so what Nero does instead, he blames the actual fire on the Christians, like the Christian community that's kind of starting to kind of be, I guess, large numbers in Rome at the time. And so they think a lot of the first persecutions of the Christians at the time really start under his reign and will continue afterwards. And so I think like there's like at least three Roman sources that mention about this. Josephus, I know, mentions a little bit about the Christians and their persecution. Also Tacitus and Suetonius, both those Roman writers also mention. I think it was Tacitus was the one. Maybe it was also Suetonius as well. But they both kind of mentioned how a lot of the actual Christians, many of them were burned to death. I think it was a deal where Nero took them and crucified them and then set them on fire and used them as like human torches, basically. Some are even fed to like wild animals to be torn apart. And I think probably some were probably crucified, which you start seeing a lot too, as well. So after that, Nero's, control over his, empire starts to kind of erode. And they think after he persecuted the Christians that his Roman armies, he starts to have a lot of internal conflict that breaks out. I'll get to it later, but what's going to happen is his armies are all going to revolt against him. And it's going to force him to commit suicide. And that'll end the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 68 CE. And you get this deal where between 68 and 69 CE, the Roman army kind of vies for power, like to control Rome. So-called Year of the Four Emperors that kind of comes right after in 69 CE. And you get this emperor named Flavius Vespasian that takes over, who will start the Flavian dynasty that follows next. So I'll get to them later about the Flavian dynasty. Probably won't have time to get to that today, but I'll talk about that probably later in the week. So yeah, so you got the like I said, the Christians are starting to kind of rise at that point in the first century. And here's kind of images kind of showing, Christians being crucified and burned. I think it was a case where they tell stories where he would have these parties, like lavish parties. He would actually take Christians and he'd burn them to make like light, for at night or something like that, like human torches. So yeah, Nero was kind of a cruel type, ruler that was in power. Now I want to get to next and talk about, of course, the rise of Christianity. Of course, the big thing that follows in the first century. You get the beginning of Christianity. They think Christianity started in the Middle East, so in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and now we call it Israel today. They think that's where early Roman Christianity started. And if you know about it, Christianity is based off of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who, of course, people today, Christians call him Jesus Christ, or just Jesus for short. And so I guess Jesus must be the most famous person in the world, I think today, it seems like it. But little background, of course, about Jesus you can see here. So yeah, he was a first century Jewish preacher and religious leader. I think there's a theory that Jesus was some kind of Jewish rabbi that was from Galilee, his hometown of Nazareth, you may have heard of, which is now in northern Israel. But they think that Jesus, over time will become the central figure of Christianity, but that'll kind of take a long time for that to kind of evolve. But most Christians kind of view Jesus being the Messiah that's foretold in the Old Testament, the Son of God, also as well. And so his movement will eventually create the largest religion in the world, which is somewhere around 2.5 billion people that actually practice Christianity today. Some variations of it, which is different religious denominations of Christianity that we have today. And of course, Jesus right there. So yeah, like that a third of the population, by the way, that's about of the world, the amount of people that practice it. So I think the only thing close to that is Islam. I think is the second largest, and then I think after that I've told you is I think it was Hinduism, right? Was I think the third largest they have after that. But yeah, Christianity, one of the three traditional Abrahamic religions. Judaism was more based on the Old Testament. Then you have, of course, Christianity, which is more based on the books in the New Testament that'll be created and compiled by the 3rd century CE or AD. Now, the life of Jesus, is based mostly on the gospel accounts. You see there Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. Those are really the most important ones, especially Matthew and Luke, which go more into like the early life of Jesus, his virgin birth, with Mary, with Joseph, Bethlehem, and all of that. And then you also got Mark and John as well. I think Matthew, Luke, and I want to say John are the ones that are kind of considered like synoptic gospels, as they called it, as well. And very short life. Jesus only, they think, lived like 30, 33 years, I think is how long he lived. So he died, they think, in his early 30s. And his actual ministry, his actual ministry that he had, they think was 3 to 3.5 years long, was how long it was. There's kind of debate about how long he preached Jesus, but somewhere between 30 to 36 CE is the time period, of course, of when that was. There's a debate about, too, when he was born, too. They're not sure about that either. It's kind of a debate. That's why they put it at like 1 CE or 1 AD. I think it's where they put it at because they're not sure of the exact date of when he was actually born. So now, they think what happened with Jesus, he was eventually arrested for blasphemy. That was actually the reason for his arrest, blasphemy, if you know about this. He was turned over at first to the Jewish consul there, Sanhedrin, I think they called it. And then the Roman authorities, of course, were the ones that could only really actually, give up actual form of punishment. And so they think the Roman prefect, which was Pontius Pilate, was the one that actually had Jesus crucified, if you know. They're not sure the year. That's kind of a debate about that. Some say 33 CE is the year, although 30 to 33 CE, I think, is the popular years of they think when Jesus may have been crucified. They think that most Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead, like afterwards, on the 3rd day. And so hence you get Easter Sunday, of course, which we just had a few days ago. And so that started the beginning of Christianity afterwards. And so all of his disciples started spreading his message throughout the Roman world, of course, from there. So I think I've got a map showing you. I think there's a map right there showing you Christianity. But over time, you can see here, Christianity will start mostly in the east. The area like where Israel, Syria is. Then you see it's going to push into Turkey and Greece, then in North Africa, Italy. Then it takes longer, but eventually it spreads all the way to France, Spain, and even Britain at one point. So parts of Britain will eventually get it, but it takes a long time for that to actually occur. Talk about the spread of it, though, first. They think that what happened was supposedly in 33 CE, like either right before Jesus died or there's even a theory that right after he died, when he rose from the dead, that he told his followers to spread his message, his gospel to the Roman world. So that was called the so-called Great Commission. They dubbed it. That led to the so-called, they call it the apostolic age, where the apostles that knew Jesus or were influenced by Jesus began to spread it throughout the world. Usually it goes from about 33 up to about 100 CE. Jesus really was crucified 33 or whatever. That's usually the date that they date it from. And if you know about Jesus, Jesus had 12 main apostles that he had that were real famous. I've kind of got a list of them right here, but Simon, Andrew, James the Great, John the Apostle, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the Less, sometimes called James the Lesser, Thaddeus, Simon. Don't forget about Judas Iscariot, that may have, they think, betrayed Jesus at the Last Supper, was later replaced by Matthias after he killed himself. So those are the 12 or 13, I guess, really with that. Of the apostles, I think these are really the most famous ones that they have down there. Got below Peter, sometimes called Simon Peter, of course, St. Peter now, Catholic and Orthodox churches. Peter, of course, was considered really the closest disciple of Jesus. Peter, would later go on to be considered the first bishop of Rome, or we call the Pope in the Catholic Church now. That's where, St. Peter's Basilica built, of course, there in Rome later. John the Apostle was also famous too, called sometimes John the Evangelist, St. John. He's kind of an important figure. John was the one that they think may have written the book of John in the book of Revelation that are in the New Testament and all that. Then you have James, the son of Zebedee. He was the brother of John the Apostle. He's called St. James. He's kind of an important figure too. That was an apostle. He was important in spreading Christianity to the West, like especially towards like Spain and all that. And so he's kind of a pretty famous saint as well, like in the Catholic Church, etc. They also have James the Less, or James the Lesser is called either different kind of names like that. He's also another Saint James. I think there's like 3 main Saint James that they have. And it's kind of a debate about James the Less. Some people think he was a brother of Jesus or half brother or something like that. He's also sometimes linked to another name you may have heard of, James the Just. You may have heard that name too as well. Matthew the Apostle, also another one who's also a famous apostle. They think he's the one that's attributed to like the Gospel of Matthew as well. So kind of talking about some of the ones that were kind of famous. Now, the one that's like really famous that they always talk about the most is Paul, St. Paul, of course, who they think really is the most influential of the different apostles. And he's very famous for spreading Christianity, from the Middle East to the rest of the Roman Empire. He's often called Paul the Apostle, or I think another name they call him Apostle of the Gentiles, I think is another nickname he's often called as well. And because of the fact that he was a Roman citizen, he was able to kind of go throughout the Roman Empire, preach, and set up different Christian churches throughout the Roman world. And if you know about Paul, he's very famous for his epistles. The epistles of Paul, that are part of the New Testament, where he wrote to different churches throughout the world. And so that had a lot of impact, really. I think out of all the different apostles, he's the one in the end that has the most influence compared to the other ones that were out there. But I think most of the apostles were killed. Like Paul, Peter, were both martyred, by the Romans. They executed under Nero. A lot of other ones were also killed afterwards as well. So that's why they were able to spread it, because I guess having Roman citizenship, he was able to spread it throughout the world in general. But you can see there in that map here, it takes a long time for it to spread. But I think part of why Christianity spread so easily was very popular with the lower classes. Talking about this idea of heaven and paradise. Later on in life, most people did not live a great life. In the Roman Empire, because most people were poor. About that, and so it was a very popular religion, which eventually overtook a lot of the pagan religions of the Roman state. Now, what happened over time, they think, was that the Christianity split. Because about Christianity, it started out as a part of or form of Judaism, which it did, and it split. It split into various sects. If you study about early Christianity, they had the Jewish Christians, which were based, like they think, in Israel, Syria, maybe Turkey, in the beginning. And they had different Jewish sects that were kind of that formed afterwards that were considered Christians. Nazarenes, which you see there, which were originally related back to Jesus. They also had the Ebionites also as well, which was like another early Christian sect. They were called the poor ones because they kind of lived this poor lifestyle that they had. And then you had those that were what we call Roman Christians, those that were like, Gentiles that were pagans, I guess, or non-Jews. And most of them are the ones that actually joined the religion and not Jews. In fact, Jews, I think, made up a minority of the actual original religion. And then over time, um, most of the people that become Christians are like basically non-Jews or non-Jewish Romans overall. So yeah, you can see that image right there. Kind of splits, especially in the post-temple period, because one of the things that really caused the split, if you know about it, is the Jewish-Roman wars. When the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, the second one in 70 CE, that's what caused the split pretty much afterwards. And so both those religions kind of break off and they go off in different directions. So you get, this deal where Judaism has got this post-temple Judaism that forms where it's based around rabbis and synagogues. That's what you get pretty much. And then Christianity is based around churches and priests, which is kind of like, I guess, gotten from the old temple from a long time ago, or maybe some Roman influences as well. So the two kind of break away at that point afterwards. There were other influences also as well. Sometimes mention about the Jewish tax that was put on Jews, which the Flavian dynasty started doing this after the first Jewish-Roman war. And if you were Jewish, you had to pay a tax. There was even a case where they would, this mostly on Jewish men, they had to pay a tax, but there was some case where Jews would actually try to disguise themselves and I'm not Jewish or anything like that. And then they'd pull your pants down and go, oh, you're circumcised, so you're Jewish. And so they would have to pay this tax. And so a lot of Christians didn't want to pay the tax. And so they say it's part of why what caused the split too, was that. Like I said, Christianity became very popular with the lower classes, in the Roman Empire. That's another reason why, of course, they split apart. Over time, so you get these two different religions, that are different from each other. You can see that are right there. Not too many people practice Judaism. So yeah, it could have been a deal where the Romans could have adopted Judaism. It's a possibility they could have done that instead of Christianity if Jesus maybe wouldn't have lived. But you can see population, Christianity is over 2 billion. In the world, how many people actually practice it? Some people don't practice it and they are Christian, but you can see that most of the traditional religions that they eventually have, Catholic and Orthodox, you'll mostly see by the Middle Ages, you get these two churches that form afterwards. You've got the Roman Catholic Church, which was in Rome, and then you got the Eastern Orthodox Church, of course, in Constantinople. And both these churches, are kind of remnants of the Roman Empire. You got the Western Roman Empire in the West, so the Roman Catholic Church. You got the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, Eastern Orthodox Church. And so both these churches kind of break away and they kind of split apart from each other over time throughout the Middle Ages. Then at the end of the Middle Ages, we get Protestantism as well. And Martin Luther kind of helped start that. You get all these Protestant denominations that are created afterwards that follow. So that's the beginning of Christianity, but it's going to take a long time for Christianity to actually develop. It takes several centuries, and Christianity doesn't really become the main religion of the Roman Empire until the 4th century. You'll see that with Constantine the Great start to adopt Christianity. Then by Theodosius the Great, it becomes the main religion of the Roman Empire. So over time, the Romans are going to, create a Christian state, but that'll take a long time for that to happen. And so between that time, Christians between the first and fourth centuries are heavily persecuted. Later, I'm going to talk about it a little later, but I'm going to talk about, I guess I don't have time today, but later in the week, I'll talk about the rise of the Flavian dynasty. That's going to come in next. They're going to take over the Flavian dynasty. I'll talk about Emperor Vespasian. He's kind of famous. Probably don't know him, but he's the actual emperor that built the Roman Colosseum. That's well known, of course, today. We'll talk about the period of the 5 good emperors, which was really the peak period of the Pax Romana, and then I'll kind of start talking, maybe if I have time, how the Roman Empire starts to decline between the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That's something that kind of starts a little later. Like I said, I'm going to first talk about this new period that comes in to the Roman Empire, the so-called Flavian period, Flavian dynasty. Which the Flavian dynasty was the 2nd imperial dynasty of the Roman Empire. You can see it was not around very long. So 69 to 96 CE, of course, was the years that they were in power. And it was only had 3 rulers that were part of it, you see. Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, and Emperor Domitian. So those are the 3 that were there. You kind of see a bigger picture of them, I guess, right there. Vespasian at the top right, and then, of course, Titus on the bottom left with Domitian. And by the way, a little about those 2. Titus and Domitian were the sons of basically Vespasian. So you see right there. And by the way, it's like the only time where you had a deal at that point in the Roman Empire where you have sons that succeed the father as emperor. That's something that's actually rare. It doesn't happen that often where that occurs. There's a few times I'll kind of talk about it here and there, but it's kind of rare that actually occurs in the Roman Empire. Let me get into the meat, of course, of talking about there. So there's kind of another image showing, of course, the 3 emperors right there, the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. A little bit about the first one, which is right here. So you see there Vespasian on the left. Vespasian was a Roman general under Emperor Nero, and he's the one that would go on to found the actual dynasty in 69 CE. A little bit about him. You see there, kind of that image right there on the bottom there, but he's well known for fighting in the so-called First Jewish-Roman War, which broke out in 66 CE. We've already talked about this before when I was talking about the history of the Israelites and Jews a long time ago. And he was one of like 2 main generals that put it down. Him and his son Titus. We'll get to Titus a little later, but Titus, both of them were involved in the defeat of the Great Jewish Revolt. It was kind of all kinds of names that it was called. Great Jewish Revolt, the Jewish War, I think was another name it was called. Remember correctly, all the Jews in Judea and also Galilee had revolted against the Roman Empire because they wanted to be independent, have their own state. So the Romans sent legions in there, led originally by Vespasian, and his son Titus, remember correctly, we talked about this before, sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the city, and along with the Second Temple. It was also burned as well. So I think we had discussed all that. Because I think I remember I talked about how it was that famous writer named Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish Roman writer that wrote about the wars in the so-called Jewish War, the book he wrote. And I think I mentioned how Vespasian had befriended him. Josephus, who was actually a former general in the war, who kind of turned toward the Roman side, and Jews later saw him as a traitor, that kind of thing. So yeah, you got that, and of course I talked about Titus. Titus was one of the main generals that fought in the war, because what happened was Vespasian took power as emperor, and he commanded the forces after that, and finished off the rest of the Jews that they wiped out after that. So yeah, the siege of Jerusalem, 70 CE, which we had talked about before. Let me get into something else, though, that I haven't really talked much about. But how did Vespasian take power and all that? Well, they had this incident that happened between 68 and 69, where a civil war broke out that historians now call it the Year of the Four Emperors. And what happened was Nero's armies rebelled against him, and he was forced to commit suicide. And so you have this case where all these emperors started fighting over the whole empire, like control of it. And so they started, declaring themselves emperors at that point. And here, kind of see them right here. But those are the four emperors that they had. Galba, I think, was the first one that seized power. Otho, Vitellius, and then Vespasian. I'll put the names on the screen so you can see them right there. But Galba, I believe, and also Otho were these two generals that were in control in Spain, in the western part of the empire. Galba seized control first, reigned about 6 months, and then Otho killed him off and seized power. He reigned for about 3 months. And then another general named Vitellius, who I think was in Germany, he took power and killed off Otho. And then he reigned about 8 months until Vespasian killed him off, basically. So like one after the other, they killed each other off until Vespasian, seized power. He was victorious in the Civil War. But that Civil War, by the way, is, I think the only major civil war they really have during the whole Pax Romana. So most of the Pax Romana is very peaceful until, of course, Commodus comes in later. I'll talk about him after Marcus Aurelius dies, but I'll get to that later when that occurs. Now, one thing about Vespasian that's very famous, he's well known for building the Roman Colosseum. Most people don't know that, like who constructed it, all that emperor. They think maybe Augustus or somebody built it, but he actually is the emperor that actually constructed it, which they think it was built in a period of like 8 years, 72 to about 80 CE. It's actually called the Amphitheatrum Flavium. That's the original name of the Roman Colosseum. But if you know what happened was Emperor Nero had built some kind of lavish palace in that area. And there was a huge statue of Nero there. It was called the Colossal of Nero. And so the name of this amphitheater became known as the Colosseum, named after that former statue. And so that's where the actual name came from. So got images, of course, of the Colosseum. Of course, probably one of the most famous, tourist attractions in modern Rome today. Kind of talk about a few things about the Roman Colosseum. It was built mostly with slave labor, like I think mostly Jews, from that Jewish Roman war that were taken, were mostly used to build it. Now, that's what they believe about that. I do have some stats on it I can kind of give you right here, but it's a massive structure. So it's about 4 stories high, 160 feet, maybe is the height of like the top of it you see on the left. That's the actual approximate measurement. So 620 feet by 513 feet, or if you want meters, 189 by 156 meters. It has 80 entrances to it, by the way, into the actual stadium. Now, I think it's considered, by the way, to be one of the first stadiums built in the world that you see later, like football stadiums or soccer or whatever. And it's built in kind of an oval shape, so it's not exactly perfectly round. And it was used for different kind of forms of entertainment. They used it, I guess the main thing that we know of they used it for was for gladiatorial competitions, but it held up to 50, 60,000 people. They think like fans that would watch, all these different entertainment that they would put on, but wild beast hunts, gladiatorial events, which I guess was the main spectacle. They would actually put on mock sea battles. There's theories and stories they've read that they may have filled it with water and had like mock naval battles, put on plays. Of course, they would often execute people in the actual Coliseum. I think there's cases where they would. One thing they would do is I think they would take POWs. They would force them to fight to the death or something like that. And then one guy standing, the guy that's left over, he'd be spared or something like that. So they think a lot of people died in the Coliseum. I think I read 500,000 or more may have died in the Coliseum. And that's over like 5 centuries that it was used because the Coliseum was used for entertainment between the 1st and the 6th centuries CE. Got other images. Kind of look at that right here, but below there's an area called the Hypogeum, and it's like an area where they store like cages for like wild animals, lions, tigers, and also where the gladiators would be down there before they would come up to basically fight. But the Colosseum itself has gone through a lot of disrepair. Earthquakes apparently affected it. It caused a lot of it to, fall apart over time. And I think they made recent repairs to it in the late 20th century. So they've kind of done repairs to it. But think about 2/3 of the original building still exists. But you can see that part, if you go back to that one right here that I showed, part of the upper deck of it's gone. So you can see only the side. So you see how tall it originally was all around. And they do think it was covered at one point. Was another thing, like a covered stadium. By the way, they do think that Emperor Titus was the one that finished it and that he opened the first games afterwards. And so from then on, they started having all these public games, which I think a lot of the public games were called like bread and circus, I think is what they were called. It was like mass entertainment, basically to do that. So anyway, I'm going to move on. I want to talk about also the other emperors that were there too, that were famous. You also got Emperor Titus that they have as well. You see right here. Titus, we talked about him already, was this Roman general, of course, that eventually took over after his father died, Vespasian. And I think we talked about him. He was the one that sacked Jerusalem, like destroyed the temple, the second temple of Jerusalem in 70 CE. He's also the one that the Arch of Titus honors. I'll kind of show that a little later. But his brother Domitian would build this famous arch, like a victory arch in Rome, which honors him and all that. But he wasn't in power that long. I think he was only in power like 26 months, Emperor Titus, and he died young of an illness. And kind of talk about a few things that he's kind of known for as emperor. There's 2 things that really mark his reign, which are kind of like catastrophes. He had bad things happen under his reign. They had 2 things happen. They had the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that occurred in the southern part of Italy, where Naples is. And then they also had a fire of Rome, like another fire that broke out in Rome in the year 80, which destroyed a bunch of buildings, including the original Pantheon temple burned down that had been built by Augustus. But really the most famous thing that happened was Mount Vesuvius erupted in the southern part of Italy. And a little bit about Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius is a famous volcano that's in southern Italy. It's about 4,200 feet is the height of the actual volcano. And it erupted on August 24th, 79 CE, destroying several Roman cities, killing maybe like 16 to 17,000 people in that region. They call it Naples. City of Naples is kind of right where it is. Pompeii, Herculaneum, you see there were some of the main cities that were affected by Mount Vesuvius. I've got an image, of course, of the volcano, which you see right there. It has erupted multiple times in history. I think I've got other images right here, kind of a map of where it erupted. So it's very close to where the Gulf of Naples, Gulf of Salerno is, which is on the western side of Italy. You can see Naples is kind of to the north of it. And you can see some of the cities nearby, like Herculaneum, Pompeii, were some of the ancient cities that were back. The Naples didn't exist back then, at the time. But it's erupted before, like during World War II, when the Allies were fighting like Italy and Germany in World War II. It actually erupted in 1944. I think it was the last major eruption of Mount Vesuvius. But the amount of power of this volcano, they say that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was one of the worst eruptions that happened, I guess, in the classical world. And I think the equal amount of power that it erupted, like volcanic ash that it spewed out, was equal to like something like 100,000 times the power of like the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and also Nagasaki in Japan during World War II. So very powerful, this volcanic eruption that occurred. I've got other images. Here's kind of some of the ruins. Now, the ruins of Pompeii, if you know about it, weren't really discovered until modern times, where they started digging it up. Because if you know about the city, it got covered by something like 15 to 20 foot of volcanic ash, like covered the whole thing. Most people didn't die of like lava. It was mostly from the volcanic ash and probably asphyxiation, not being able to breathe because of all the smoke and all that. And so, yeah, you get all these ruins left over where they started, digging it up, the whole city. And so they find a lot of the buildings are still intact, like the road's still intact and things like that. So you can see kind of images kind of here. I'll let you see right here. But of course, the one thing that's very famous, there's the amphitheater, of course, at Pompeii. They find, if you know about it, they found bodies everywhere. People that weren't able to escape from the eruption, where they were kind of left in agony as they kind of died. You can see there. And so I think you took like plaster of Paris and they kind of were able to form the bodies out of it. But one thing that is very famous about Pompeii, and I think also at Herculaneum, was that they found a lot of skeletal remains of like Roman citizens or slaves. And back then, most Romans would cremate their dead. It's one of the things that they would do. So it's kind of rare that you would find actual skeletal remains of humans in Roman times. So that's basically kind of what happened with Pompeii. And there's a lot of refugees that kind of came from that, because of what happened with the actual eruption. Oh, one thing that is famous about the Pompeii, what happened with Pompeii, and the volcanic eruption about Vesuvius, it was actually the first volcanic eruption that somebody actually wrote about it. Because for that, we've had other eruptions they've had. But Pliny the Younger, who was a lawyer at the time and also a writer, wrote a series of letters that he wrote to the historian Tacitus, telling about what had happened. And I think he had an uncle that was called Pliny the Elder. He died in the actual volcanic eruption, but he described his experiences and what the volcanic eruption was like. And so that's why we kind of know a lot more about the volcanic eruption and all that. Compared to others. But yeah, I think by the 19th century, they started doing a lot of actual real excavations, archaeological wise. And so we know more about, of course, Pompeii from also archaeology as well. Now, they also got Domitian. I wanted to talk a little bit about him as well. He, of course, is the last of the Flavian emperors. He's the longest reigning, 15 years that he was in power. He's the younger brother of Emperor Titus, of course, also the other son of Vespasian that comes in. He's kind of an unpopular ruler later. If you know about Domitian, he was this authoritarian ruler that kind of reigned with an iron fist, and he was a total autocrat. That's something you start seeing later with a lot of the emperors, of course, in the future with the Roman Empire. But he did start one thing he did, Domitian, he was a pretty good administrator, and he began rebuilding Rome. Because remember, I told you Rome had burned in a fire in 80 CE. And so he took it upon himself to kind of rebuild it. I think he may have built something like 50-something buildings at one point in the city of Rome. And then I think there was one thing, you can kind of see some of the things he did right here with that. But he's famous for building the Arch of Titus, which he built to honor his brother Titus, who had taken basically the city of Jerusalem during that first Jewish-Roman war, and it was also built by Jewish slave labor as well, along with the Colosseum. So I think it actually has, if you go look on the inside of it, it's actually got pictures of Jews carrying some of the spoils of war back or something like that, or soldiers that are also in there too. But it's something he's kind of famous for building. His reign, of course, if you know about it, he eventually got assassinated. That's one thing about that's kind of famous. September 18th, 96, some kind of court conspiracy eventually led to his elimination, where he was stabbed to death in his palace. And so he was killed off. And so that ended the Flavian dynasty real quick, which didn't reign very long. So reigned 69 to 96 CE. And one of his advisors was put in afterwards, named Nerva. I think Marcus Nerva, I think maybe his full name. But he basically will take over afterwards as the actual emperor. Now I'll get to it in a second. Of course, we'll talk about what occurs after Domitian dies. You get this new period that comes in afterwards, which they call it the so-called period of the five good emperors, which a lot of historians seem to think that period is like the peak of the Pax Romana, which is like a period of like 80-something years, where you have several Roman emperors that are real popular, not just with the Roman people, but also with the Roman Senate. And it was part of a dynasty that actually was called, it was actually two dynasties, one called Nerva, named after that first ruler Nerva that comes in after Domitian is killed. And then you have another dynasty called Antonine as well. And so simply they call it the Nerva Antonine dynasty or dynasties. And however, in modern times, I think in the 16th century, there was this famous writer you may have heard about named Machiavelli. You see on the bottom right, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote that famous work called The Prince, which was like a political treatise. And he coined the term five good emperors because he believed that at one point Rome had five good emperors in a row, which is kind of rare. And so that name stuck, of course, afterwards. So here's, of course, the emperors, of course, that come in later. The first one on the left I told you about is Nerva. His full name is Marcus Nerva, who, by the way, was a Roman senator that the Senate put in power afterwards. And he would reign only about a year or two, 96 to 98. I think he was pretty old when he died. I want to say 60s, maybe when he died. And he tried to implicate some reforms, I think, into the empire, but he was unpopular because he didn't really have a military background. And so they forced him to adopt a Roman general as his successor. And so that's what brought in Emperor Trajan. You see there next to him. He comes in 98 to 117 and rules. Third one is Hadrian, of course. Emperor Hadrian will be the third ruler. I'll get to him later. He's known for building Hadrian's Wall. Antoninus Pius is the fourth good emperor. And then you have also the last one I'll get to later, which is Marcus Aurelius. Might have been the most famous one of the five, eventually in the end. He, of course, comes in at the end. They think he rules to what is like the end of the Pax Romana. But let me get to first Emperor Trajan, a little bit about him. Trajan was this militaristic emperor that hailed from Spain. He was like one of the first emperors that came out of Spain. I think he was originally born where now Seville is, Seville, Spain. In fact, Trajan and Hadrian were both from Spain, those two emperors, and very militaristic. One thing about Trajan that's very famous, he's known for expanding the Roman Empire further. In fact, under his reign, they think the empire peaks in size. like the largest overall, which I think 117 is considered to be the date of when he would basically do that. And I'll get to it in a second, but he conquers a lot of aspects of the empire which are in the east, parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Mesopotamia, and he also at one point took over Turkey as well, part of, I think, the eastern part of Turkey, which they had conquered at one point. And you'll see that right here. I think I've got a slide showing this, but he had a nickname that the Senate called him, which was Optimus Princeps, actually, was the actual name, which means best ruler, is what it meant. And it's a title he earned because he was sort of a great ruler, and I guess because of all of his conquests throughout the world. And then also, I'll get to it in a second, he's also known for his building projects as well, Emperor Trajan. And he's known for most of his conquests. If you go to this map right here, the areas that he conquered and expanded the Roman Empire were into, there was an area called Dacia, which was kind of west of the Black Sea, where Romania is. He conquered that whole region. So I think I want to say Romania, maybe part of Bulgaria is today. He conquered that area. He also fought the Parthian Empire and was actually successful and conquered Mesopotamia and took it back. So I think they had held it at one point. The Romans had lost it. So he actually had that. And then he also took over Armenia and part of where Georgia is today. But the state of Georgia, you know where that is, where it's kind of like right below Russia and the Ukraine. And then they also think he took part of like where Jordan is today, which may have been one of his last conquests that he took over. So that's the extent of the Roman Empire, they think, in the year 117, when Emperor Trajan died. And they think it's around like somewhere like 2 million square miles or so, maybe the size of the empire, the largest it ever got. Also, the other thing he's known for too, Trajan also built this extensive forum, which became known as Trajan's Forum, and it included like a series of baths, markets. Also, you can see in the middle there, it had this victory column he built that was called Trajan's Column. And Trajan's Column was this victory column he built to honor his military victories in Dacia, like in that area Romania is today. And so that's basically kind of what he became known for. So he wasn't just, this, I guess, this soldier emperor, which is kind of what he was, Emperor Trajan, but he was known for his building projects. He had baths and markets, like Trajan's Baths, I think were kind of well known for a bunch of years as well. Then you have Emperor Hadrian. He would be the third of the 5 good emperors that would come in next. Hadrian was also militaristic too. In fact, he was a cousin of Emperor Trajan. In fact, he married one of, I think, his relatives. I think he married like a second cousin that was related to, basically, to Trajan. And one thing that was different about Hadrian kind of abandoned a lot of the policies of Emperor Trajan. Trajan was trying to expand, the empire as further as he could, but Hadrian went away from that. He decided that they needed more boundaries that were more stable, and so he started fortifying certain areas or putting borders at like rivers or oceans or seas, and that's something that he began to do. That's kind of well known. Got another image right here, of course, of Hadrian. Hadrian also was known for being this very big fond of Greek culture, Greek architecture, Greek literature, the Greek arts, things like that. He was kind of somewhat educated, and because of this fondness for Greek things, he got the nickname the Greekling, is what some people sometimes would call him. And he was kind of an amateur architect, actually designed buildings, built fortifications, like the Hadrian's Wall we'll talk about mostly. And he also built the Pantheon Temple, which was actually rebuilt from the reign of Augustus. So he was known for a lot of things. He's kind of well known for. You can see here's kind of an image of Hadrian on the left. Of course, most famous thing that he's kind of well known for is the building of what we call Hadrian's Wall. Of course, it's named for the famous emperor today. Hadrian's Wall, if you know much about it, was this fortification that Hadrian built around the 120 CE in like the northern part of Britain at the time, like northern part of Roman Britain, basically. And it was constructed to keep out various barbarians that were in Scotland that were above, which were mostly two groups. One were the Picts, I think they were called, and then you have the so-called Caledonians, which I think is what they call it later, the so-called Scottish people that are there throughout that region. And the actual Hadrian's Wall, which I've got a map of it right here, it's about 80 miles, at least 80 Roman miles in length is how long it is. I think the actual length of the actual wall is 73 miles in length, like modern miles today, but 80 Roman miles, which a Roman mile is like 0.92 miles, I think, today, an equivalent of it. But you can see it actually ran in the northern part of England, close to where Newcastle upon Tyne is. The Tyne, you can see the River Tyne, that's right there. So that's about where it ran across northern England. I think it's about 117 or 118 kilometers in length, if you want kilometers also as well. So that actually became Rome's most northern border that they had, and it protected, of course, Rome and Britain, like I said, from barbarians that are in the north. Here's other images of Hadrian's Wall, which is right there. So yeah, it's kind of considered, by the way, one of the most famous archaeological features that's still left, in Britain today. It's like one of the oldest things that they have now. And I've got other images of it right here, but the height of the wall varied. I think they say the average height of the wall was like 12 to 15 feet, maybe. They're not sure exactly the height of it. That's kind of debated today, but 12 to 15 possibly was the height of the wall. Today it's been stripped, by up to like modern times. And so I think the height of the wall might be closer to like 6 feet now, what's left of it. And then the actual width of the wall, that varied. I think I've seen 6 to 8 feet maybe being like the width of the actual wall itself that was constructed. And they added like fortifications like, castles and mile castles and things like that to fortify the wall, intervening turrets, ditches, and other things to prevent people from breaking through. But they still had problems where people would still break through from the north. But that's why they had the mile castles. I guess they would have like every mile they would have like a little fortification there where they would hold Roman troops there, and then if they get attacked, they could stop it, stuff like that. So they consider that to be, like I said, the most northern part of the wall. I'll get to it later. They do have another wall that they have, which is called you'll kind of see it right there, but it's called the Antonine Wall. Built later by Antoninus Pius, another emperor after that. They'll build that one up there and close to where southern Scotland is, but they abandoned that wall, I think Marcus Aurelius came in. So that's the northern part of really the empire, of course, and you can see it's way up there, like in northwestern Europe, and basically in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of where it was built. Yeah, let me get to another emperor. Wait, well, one more thing I forgot to talk about that's kind of famous, of course, about Emperor Hadrian. He's also known for building the Pantheon Temple. Have you heard about this temple that he kind of rebuilt in the 120s CE? The Pantheon Temple was this Greco-Roman temple that was originally built by Emperor Augustus. I think Marcus Agrippa actually built it under him. And supposedly it honored like all the Greco-Roman gods, which is why it's called the Pantheon, but it burned. Like I think I told you about in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, they had this fire break out And so I think it got struck by lightning and it burned down. And so Hadrian took it upon himself to basically redesign it and build it, in which he did. And it had a 142-foot dome that was built with it. Here's kind of another image of course, the Pantheon, which you see there. And it was, I think, completed around 125 or 126. I think that's kind of the year they think of when it was completed. And if you know about the actual temple, it's very famous for that oculus, that opening that's in the top of the actual building of the structure of that dome. And it's a big tourist attraction today in Rome. I want to say that one in the Colosseum. Those two structures are really the most famous that tourists like to go look at. But it is considered one of the best preserved in the Roman world. They have. But one thing about it, if you go back to the image of it, it kind of combines like Greek architecture, with Roman ideas. And so it's kind of interesting. You can see the Corinthian columns on it and stuff. So it looks like a Greek temple, in the front. And it's got this dome structure on the back of it that it's got as well. So that's the so-called Pantheon temple, which, of course, Emperor Hadrian had rebuilt. There's one more thing I think that I've already talked about it before, I believe. But if you remember correctly, Hadrian was the one that put down the Bar Kokhba revolt. I think I already discussed this already before, but 132 to 136, they had one more major Jewish-Roman war that broke out. The so-called Bar Kokhba revolt, where that Jewish prophet claimed that he was the Messiah or something like that. And so it was a bloody, bloody war between the Romans and the Jews. And they think a few 100,000 Jews were killed during that conflict as well. And they think that's part of it. I think I mentioned this before, how they think Emperor Hadrian is the one that started the whole Jewish diaspora, where they forced all the Jews out of, where Israel is now, and they spread throughout the Roman Empire. And so that's something that kind of happened, after the temple was destroyed, and then you have this, of course, happen as well. All right, then I want to talk about, of course, we also have Antoninus Pius, of course, another famous Roman emperor that comes after the fourth of the five good emperors. Antoninus Pius, if you study about him, he's one of the longest reigning emperors of this period. In fact, third longest after Augustus and Tiberius that would reign. So almost around 23 years that he's in power as emperor. You can see there he was adopted by Emperor Hadrian. One thing about the kind of seeing a common thing here going on with these emperors coming in, they have a nickname for the five good emperors. They were called the adoptive emperors. They're sometimes called. So they get this whole succession of being adopted, after that. Antoninus, he was called Pius, by the way, kind of somewhat religious, but there was a deal where he tried to have I want to say his father deified or something like that. And so he got the name Pius because of that afterwards. But he's the founder of the Antonines, which the Antonines is a series of emperors that reigned over this period, which included Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius had a brother named Lucius Verus, and then he had also Commodus. So he had four emperors that were basically in the Antonines. So it's kind of almost like a separate dynasty of rulers. But they do think that this particular emperor was considered really the peak ruler of the Pax Romana, because they think up to his time, very few wars were fought, very peaceful. I think the only thing that actually happened under his reign was that he tried to conquer the northern part of where Scotland is today, which I think he failed. And he just stopped it at where we got this image right here, but he actually built another border where southern Scotland is, where the Firth of Forth is, kind of between England and Scotland. And so he built this turf barrier right there that's about 39 miles long. And so they tried to put the northern border of Rome and Britain there at that point. And I think I've got an image showing part of the Antonine Wall, which was mostly like a wall they built out of stone with turf on top of it, which was built in the 140s. But the Romans abandoned it, I think, after he died. And so they went back to Hadrian's Wall after that. And Hadrian's Wall was kind of used as the northern border to about the 4th, 5th centuries. So, yeah, he's not really known for too much. I kind of go back and talk about Hadrian. Hadrian actually adopted 2 successors, which were Marcus Aurelius, who was like a nephew through his wife, Faustina. And he was also a Roman general. And then also he adopted Lucius Verus, who was another Roman general as well. And so those 2 would actually come in and become co-rulers afterwards. But usually Lucius Verus is counted as one of the 5 good emperors. But Marcus Aurelius, of course, is. So I'll talk about him next, which is Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius, if you study about him, he's the last of the 5 good emperors that reigns, up to the end of the Pax Romana. You can see he reigned 161 to 180, about 19 years that he was in power. And he did share power with a brother, well, adopted brother, I guess, which is Lucius Verus. He was called, who only reigned for about 8 years, but both were basically like Roman generals that came in. And he actually married the daughter of Antoninus Pius. So he kind of married into their family also as well. So it's kind of weird about that. His mother was basically his stepmother, and he married his stepsister. If you think that's kind of weird, but he did. But anyway, I think she was also a cousin of his, by the way. But anyway, kind of see images, of course, of Marcus Aurelius right there. He's known for a bunch of things. One thing that starts happening under Marcus Aurelius is the Pax Romana starts coming to an end, and they start getting in all these wars. You can see there's actually 2 big wars that kind of break out during his reign in Lucius Verus. They've got the Roman-Parthian War, and then they also have this other war called the Marcomannic Wars that also broke out as well. And kind of talk about first the Roman-Parthian War. The Roman-Parthian War was this war that was fought mostly in Syria and Mesopotamia against the Parthians. The Romans fight the Parthians forever, for many centuries. They're fighting them. And Lucius Verus was sent there to the east. And so he was actually pretty successful fighting against the Parthians. And they actually sacked their capital. The capital of the Parthian Empire was Ctesiphon, which is actually on, I think, where the river Euphrates is. It's actually close to where the modern city of Baghdad is now. And they sacked and took the city, and then they kind of controlled part of Mesopotamia and part of Syria and Turkey after that. And so they kind of regained territory that they had lost, believe it or not, before that. So that was something that he was kind of known for. And I think when Lucius Verus was on campaign in the East, he died of some kind of illness. And so after that, Marcus Aurelius, starting in 166, reigned by himself. Then they had another series of wars called the Marcomannic Wars, where these were a series of wars that were fought kind of in Europe, like close to where southern Germany and Austria is today. And they had a bunch of tribes there, like Goths, Germans, and other tribes that were trying to break into the Roman Empire. And so Marcus Aurelius basically prevented that from happening. But it was a bloody conflict, but it's kind of the future of a lot of wars that are going to come in the Roman Empire, where they're going to have to fight all these Germanic peoples that start entering the empire. And it's what kills off the Western Empire. The only bad thing was they won a lot of these wars, but apparently they brought back an illness from the wars, which were called some kind of plague they called later the Antonine Plague, which some people claimed it was maybe smallpox or something like that. and it started killing off millions of people within the Roman Empire. They think that helped contribute to why the Roman Empire began to decline between the second and third century, because it killed off, like they say, about 10% of the population or more, including Marcus Aurelius. They think may have died of that illness in 180. By the way, one more thing about Marcus Aurelius you may have heard about. He's very famous for a series of personal writings that they call the Meditations or Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And these were a series of writings that were written in 12 books that were about what we call Stoicism, which is a type of philosophy that was real popular in the Roman world at the time. And Stoicism was a type of Hellenistic philosophy that had been spread by this philosopher from Greece named Zeno of Citium. You may have heard of him, who lived back in the 3rd century BC. And apparently under the Romans, there was kind of a neo movement to kind of bring it back, like neo-Stoicism. And so Marcus Aurelius was considered like a student of that particular philosophical movement. And I think sometimes he was called the philosopher emperor or something like that because of it. And meditations has become real popular, in the modern world. A lot of his philosophy and his sayings of Marcus Aurelius, but they think it actually, it wasn't meant to be published. That's one weird things about, meditations. And it was found from, I think, 2 manuscripts that were found in the Vatican Library, I want to say around the 16th century. They compiled into one book, which is now the main, Meditations of Marcus Aurelius that's around now today. So there's Marcus Aurelius, of course, kind of a, soldier emperor. Is kind of what he was kind of known for. Now, the only thing was, of course, we'll get to there, by the way, is a victory column that you're looking at right there on the right, the column of Marcus Aurelius, which was erected in Rome later. That was actually erected to celebrate his victories over the Marcomannic, in the Marcomannic Wars. That was actually built by his son Commodus, which of course I kind of talk a little bit about today and get in. Commodus, will come in as emperor. In fact, actually co-ruled with his father for a few years before he died in 180. In fact, 177 to 180, he reigned with his father, and then 180 to 192, he reigned by himself. So you can see there he reigned about roughly close to 15 years as emperor. I just got the 12 years, I guess, as sole emperor I've got listed right there. They think Commodus is the one that they often blame for why the Pax Romana goes away. They kind of claim that he's this emperor that becomes notorious for being maybe tyrannical, possibly. I think there's even some think he may have been possibly insane. I think they speculate Caligula may have been crazy or something like that. But they definitely think Commodus may have been insane, for sure. I think he's been depicted that way in a lot of movies and things like that. I think he was also a megalomaniac, and he had this cult of personality that he had about himself, kind of like almost like a version of like Emperor Stalin, like of the Soviet Union or something like that kind of thing. But here's kind of images of him right here on the right. One thing that he's very famous for, Emperor Commodus, if you know about him, would also often participate as a gladiator in the Roman Colosseum. That's one thing he's well known for. In fact, he would participate in a lot of the wild beast hunts and actually fight gladiators, like single combat, things like that. And I think a lot of the competitions may have been fixed or something like that, where he could easily win the actual battle. That's something he's kind of notorious for, Commodus. And a lot of the lower classes loved it, but a lot of the upper classes thought it was just insane what he was trying to do. It's almost like, the president going on TV and wrestling or something like that. And that's kind of what he was basically doing. Then other things started to go bad as well. By the end of his reign, there was a fire again. Rome was struck by another fire in 191. And Commodus threatened to rename and build the city after himself, which is Commodiana. was what he was going to call it. And he started kind of seeing himself as this, I'm the new Romulus and that kind of thing. And so he was kind of off his rocker, I guess, at that point. And some kind of conspiracy formed against him. And so what happened eventually, he was eventually killed, if you know about that. December 31st, I think 192 CE, he was actually assassinated. I know they have that movie you may have seen before, which is the movie Gladiator, where Joaquin Phoenix plays Commodus. Probably may have seen that movie, which came out in the year 2000 with Russell Crowe playing the main character. Of course, that eventually kills Commodus. But in reality, I think Commodus was actually strangled by a wrestler, like in the bathtub, and that's how he died. And he didn't die in the Coliseum or anything like that. But what happens with him being killed at that point, it brings in civil war breaks out, and they think that's kind of obvious reasons why the Pax Romana is starting to end at that point. And so you get this thing where the so-called Year of the Five Emperors comes in. Now, I'll kind of talk briefly about what that was basically, and then I'll spend a few minutes also talking about this new dynasty that seizes power afterwards, which is of course called the Severan dynasty. But yeah, that movie Gladiator was real popular, but a lot of the stories about Commodus, I think a lot of that's kind of made up maybe about him. But he did, fight as a gladiator. That is something he's kind of known for, of course, in Roman history. Now, they have this period that's called the Year of the Five Emperors, which that was actually happened in 193. You had this deal where 5 Roman emperors actually were in power. That's amazing that you have this happen, of course, right there. But you see that there's the 5 right there: Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and then Septimius Severus. So those are the 5, of course, that get into power at that point. And talk a little bit about all those 5 right there. Pertinax, you see the one on the left, I'll kind of blow that up right there. Pertinax, he was a Roman general and also a senator that seized power, and he reigned for 87 days as emperor. And apparently he seized the throne by bribing the Praetorian Guard and evidently didn't pay him enough. And so they killed him off, basically. And so the next guy, Didius Julianus, you see there, the second right there, he reigned 66 days as emperor. Apparently, he won the actual position of emperor through some kind of auction, believe it or not, in the Senate, and he got it. But they turned on him, the Praetorian Guard, and they killed him. And then Pescennius Niger came in. I think he was another, like a Roman general or something like that. He reigned like 1 month as emperor. And then they'd also have Clodius Albinus. I think he was more of a pretender that tried to take the throne too. But he was later killed off by Septimius Severus. And then Septimius Severus, you see on the right, was a Roman general that went back to Commodus's reign, and he's the one that actually would take over. So that's the so-called Year of the Five Emperors, where you have 5 emperors that reign. Believe it or not, later, I'll talk about later, I think in the crisis period of the 3rd century, they have a Year of the 6 Emperors, where there's 6 emperors in 1 year. So totally chaos, with what's going on. So it's obviously the Pax Romana is starting to unravel at that point. But they do have this deal where a new emperor comes in and he kind of stabilizes things at that point. And that emperor I told you about is Septimius Severus. So he comes in and creates his own dynasty called the Severan dynasty. You see, and you see the Severans reigned for about 42 years, 193 to 235 CE. That they were in power. Kind of see more information about Septimius Severus. He's the one that seized power in the Year of the Five Emperors. Interesting thing about him, first emperor to come out of Africa, like one of the African provinces, and he came from this city in North Africa, Libya, that's called Magna Leptis. You may have heard of it because there's like ruins of it that are still on the northern coast. of Libya. And there's kind of interesting things about him. See, he reigned 193 211. They think he's some kind of Semitic background. I'm not sure what it exactly is, but maybe part Carthaginian or something like that, possibly was what he was. But he's very famous for his wife. I think I've got images showing the actual Severan dynasty. So they had 5 rulers, actually 6 rulers in it, excuse me, 6 rulers in the Severan dynasty, Septimius Severus, and then he's got Caracalla and Geta. I'll get to them later. Those are the sons of Septimius Severus. Macrinus was actually this Roman prefect that seized power, that briefly reigned. Then Elagabalus and Severus Alexander were cousins of Caracalla and Geta, and they basically also ruled as well. Here's a family tree of the Severan dynasty. You can see at the kind of top in the left, Severus had this wife he had that was very famous named Julia Domna. Julia Domna was actually pretty powerful as an empress. In fact, some people think she was kind of the power behind the throne. And she even had a sister later named Julia Misa that had a lot of power as well, because she had some relatives that took power later that were related to her. But they think that Julia Domna was related to some kind of Arab lineage, like she was Arab, and she was from Syria, or it's like Syrian part of the Roman Empire. And she had all kinds of nicknames. The Romans would call her the mother of the invincible camps, or she was also called Julia the Pious or Julia the Augusta, I think was other names that she was dubbed. And she had 2 sons that would reign as emperors, Caracalla and Geta, which you see below Septimius Severus and Julia Domna in that family tree. And those 2, it's interesting about Caracalla and Geta, they were actually twins, these twin sons. Of course, that reigned kind of like Romulus and Remus. That's kind of rare. But I think the only twins that actually reigned as emperors of the Roman Empire at one point. And they co-ruled together like equals, Caracalla and Geta. But if you know the story about what happened, Caracalla grew jealous of Geta because I think he was more popular, maybe better looking. And so Caracalla had Geta killed. And so Caracalla would then reign by himself, of course, afterwards. I do have an image of Caracalla, which you see on the left. Caracalla was not his real name. His real name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but he went by this name or nickname Caracalla because he wore this some kind of Roman cloak that was called a Caracalla, and so he got the nickname Caracalla. That's what people called him instead. But he was kind of a tyrannical ruler. But one thing he did do that's very famous, Caracalla, he's the one that issued the Edict of Caracalla in 212, which you see there, which that edict was this Roman edict that basically said that all Romans living within the empire, like free men, could get citizenship. And so they think they did that because the Romans wanted to find some kind of way to increase taxation. And so that's the reason why they did that. And I think also, if you go back to that image right there, also, if you became a citizen, especially a man, you had to serve in the Roman army. So it was a way to also bring more men in, of course, to serve in the Roman armies. Also, he's known for the so-called Baths of Caracalla. You may have heard about that. The Baths of Caracalla were a series of baths he built in Rome between about 212 to 216. And I think him and the Emperor Diocletian later were some of the last emperors to actually build Roman baths. They were, real popular that the people used within the city of Rome. And so it's something that he's kind of known for, Caracalla. I'll get to the crisis period in a second, but I might just have to briefly talk about that in a second. But let me go back and talk about some of the other rulers that they had. The Severan dynasty was very bloody. In fact, out of the 6 emperors, 5 were assassinated, which is true about that. If you go to that image right there, Macrinus, which is in the middle, Macrinus was this Roman prefect that was the head of the Praetorian Guard. He had Caracalla assassinated, and he took power between 217 and 218. And so he briefly reigned, but he wasn't directly related to the Severans. So he's not a relative of theirs, but he would briefly reign. Then what happened was, if you go back to this, you go right to, I think, that image I had of the family tree. There was a woman named Julia Misa. You may have heard of her. She was a sister of Julia Domna. She was able to get her grandson put on the throne, which is Elagabalus. And so she put him in power, basically. He would reign for about 4 years. And I don't know if you know much about Elagabalus. Elagabalus was this emperor that was kind of famous for worshiping a sun god called Elagabalus. I think it was like a type of Roman Arab sun god that was kind of popular in the Roman world. And so he went by that name. And so he reigned for a few years. And he was real well known, by the way, for doing that, but was later assassinated. Then on the far right, they also have Severus Alexander. Severus Alexander was the last of the Severan dynasties. He's also, you can see, the longest reigning about 13 years that he was in power. One thing he's very famous for, he's considered one of the youngest emperors to take power, like around 13 years old when he came to power. And you can see he probably reigned to his 20s before he was assassinated too, also as well. And so that's kind of the affair, of the whole, Severan dynasty, because what ends up happening, you get this period that comes in afterwards. I'll probably be talking about more of this later, but Severus Alexander, his assassination causes what they call the so-called crisis of the 3rd century to break out. And this was like an imperial anarchy period where basically what happened was it's almost like the Roman Empire imploded internally and it almost collapsed. I think it was a case, I'll get to it later, where it actually breaks up into like 3 parts. And it looked like the empire was just going to go away at the point in the 3rd century. But I'll get to it later. It's saved in the 270s and 280s by 2 emperors, one named Aurelian, who puts it back together. And then you have Emperor Diocletian that starts making reforms to the Roman Empire. So I'll talk about that later, of course, in next week. Next week, I'm going to probably wrap up the Roman Empire. We'll talk about the decline of the Roman Empire between the 3rd and the 5th centuries. I'll also talk about how the Roman Empire in the 4th century becomes Christian. That's one thing you'll see. Emperors Constantine the Great, Emperor also Theodosius the Great, they start adopting Christianity. That's something you start seeing where the Roman Empire becomes this Christian state. That'll be, and it also eventually will break up by close to about the 5th century.